Okay, here's a render of a glass jar in 3D Studio Max. Now it's transparent because we can see through to the green behind it. But looking at the alpha channel, you can see obviously there is a solid object there. Now if we wanted to get this into Photoshop as a sprite for a game that could go on any background, there's actually quite a level of difficulty involved in that. But do seem to have managed to find a way, which I'm going to do this tutorial on, that gives reasonable results and allows it to be put pretty much anywhere. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide everything else in the scene. So hide unselected and then do a render. So here is our jar on a transparent background. Okay, now black, because I've used a black background, black is our transparent area. But still looking here, Max doesn't do the alpha channel based on the fall off, for example, as I did on the reflection. So how do we solve this? Well, what we're going to use is we're going to use Photoshop, and we're going to use the actual brightness values here, hence why we're using a black background. We're going to use the brightness values to actually calculate the transparency. So we're assuming where it's black we can see right through it, where it's a colour obviously we can't. So I'm going to save this image out as jar.tga. Okay. And then we're going to go over into Photoshop. So here we are in Photoshop. Open up jaro.tga. Now down here I've got the background that we're going to be using in our render, so I'm going to put that in there. This is the background that I want our jar to be in the game, in effect. Now I'm just going to add another layer as well behind here. Fill that with black, just so we have some solidity. Okay, so we're going to use the darkness as transparent and the brightness as completely solid. So what I'm going to do, looking here, you can see our jar on a black background. So what I need to do is actually make a copy of those two layers and merge them together so that it is now a solid jar on a black background. And we're going to do various things with this, so I'm going to make a couple of copies just so we've always got a backup to go back to. Now first of all, when we start deleting areas, it's going to make it kind of wishy-washy and partly transparent. So I want to bump up the colour and the general punch straight away, and the best way I've found of doing that and keeping it all as it should be is to go to Image, Adjustments, and then Shadow Highlight, and that just pumps everything up here, just the defaults. Click OK. Then going to the Hue Saturation and just increasing the saturation a smidge. I've used 35 here, and that gives us a nice vibrant set of things. It is going to get more wishy-washy in a minute. Okay, let's turn that layer off. Here's our original one we created. Now this one I want to use as my mask, if you like, my alpha channel. So what I'm going to do is I need to make it, first of all, I need to make it into a grayscale by desaturating it. And then by adjusting the levels I can adjust how much everything is, basically making it like this. There you go, it almost be entirely solid with only a little bit of transparency in it. Whereas if I make it this way, it's almost entirely transparent with just the reflections. So I'm going to get the balance that I feel is right. I want it to be almost completely transparent in the middle here. So that's what I'm going to go with. Okay, now when we have this visible like this in black and white, if we go to Channels and just control click on RGB, it makes a selection based on the brightness that's in there. So going back to layers and turning off all these layers and just seeing, in actual fact just seeing the black image, we can see the marching ants very clearly. And if I create a new layer and fill that with red, you can see this is, if I turn this off, that's the transparency. So we've actually now got our mask for the transparency of the layer. Now control clicking on this layer brings us back to the marching ants. Bring back the colour version, go onto that layer, Control Shift I to invert and delete. Now Control it to the, and now there you have it. That is how it looks. Now it's not got everything that the original had. If I turn that on behind it, you'll see that's the original. But it's a good starting point. If I turn off the background layer, you can see this is how it is transparent. Okay, so let's turn on the game background we want to see it on, and as you can see it's very, very ghostly, hardly visible at all. So let's compound it by making a copy on top. Still not very strong. Another copy on top. Still not very strong. And another copy on top. And it's starting, I'll do another one, to come good, but it's still very, very ghostly. So what I'm going to do, the original render that came out of 3ds Max, if I turn that on and put it behind, now if I make that partially transparent, you can see we actually get something that's starting to look right. If I'd just done that from the start without these extra overlays, obviously the whole thing just goes transparent. But with these overlays built in now, it seems to work pretty well. Now, for the style of game we're doing, we're having these black outlines around things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually put the opacity of the layer back up to 100, and instead go to the layer style and put a stroke on it, make it black. It's going to make it 2 pixels, 3 is usually too thick. Go OK. Now instead of changing the opacity of the layer, which if we do that it will change the opacity of the stroke as well. But if we leave that at 100 and instead change the opacity of the fill, and this actually makes the insides go away but keeps the stroke. So we're now going to set this till it looks about right, and I would say that's looking about right. Now I'm just going to put all the visible layers together, and I'm just going to put them into a folder. And now, as it's a folder, I can grab the whole folder and move it around, and you can see the effect that we've got it transparent. Obviously it's not distorting the background, it can't do refraction of the background, but it does mean it can go anywhere on the layer. If I make a copy of that group, turn off the original, right click, merge group, and it just becomes a single graphic. And now to make this completely fit in the layer, we'll do the hue saturation again. I'm just going to tilt it back towards greens, which seem to be the major theme in this one, and just desaturate it a bit to there. Looks right. Click OK, and there we have my demijohn, and it sits very, very nicely in this scene. If you'd have filled this with water or with clear liquid, as we were, or indeed coloured liquid, the same processes would still work. Now obviously I've been jumping around here for the purposes of the tutorial, but in reality you could set this up as an automated process, so if you had frames of maybe the fluid filling up and disappearing, which is what we're going to do in our game, you could actually have that and make it batch all the frames for you. Okay, I hope that helps.